Oh yes, I did, folks. I did. I failed calculus during my first semester of computer science, and I learned some very crucial lessons in the process. I wasn't studying, I was so lazy, in the beginning of my first semester of computer science because I undermined my course and I thought everything was easy. And also, last year I had taken a gap year, and maybe I was a bit lazy also because I had taken a whole break from school. So when I started school again in the beginning of 2023, I just started off the year as a really lazy person who just kept procrastinating. So in today's video, I'll tell you my story as a computer science student battling with mathematics in college, and I'll also tell you my lessons that I have learned in the process. So this is what happened. I got distinctions in high school mathematics. I did really well, and when I came to college, I assumed that things were just as easy as they were in high school. I began doing calculus during my first semester, and I realized that there were topics, similar topics that I did in high school, such as functions, such as differentiation and so forth, and trigonometry. So I had done really well in high school algebra, and so because of that, I assumed that calculus was just some simple mathematics that you will just study last minute and you just pass and freestyle. But guess what? I was totally wrong because there's just a huge difference. If I can give you a review or a description of calculus in a few words, I can say calculus is just simply the study of the behavior of numbers and how numbers behave basically, and that's very different from high school mathematics. In the case of calculus, you get deep into numbers. You're studying really how numbers behave, such as, for example, the limit of what is what approaches what. So basically, you're not just doing calculations necessarily. You're basically playing around with numbers in all sorts of ways, and that's what makes calculus a bit tricky. So I was completely wrong. And so as time went, I began to see myself fail. I failed my major test and I was getting so worried. Because I had qualified to write my examinations with a very low CA of 47%, I failed my examinations in the end and I didn't pass calculus, and that's how I failed calculus, and I'll be doing it again next year. So what lessons did I learn through my failure? How would I approach calculus differently again? So one thing that I've learned, the first thing that I've learned is that calculus is not a last minute subject. What do I mean by last minute? I mean that it's not the kind of subject that you just want to study at the last minute. You have a test tomorrow and then you're only starting to study it today. Calculus requires your full attention, and if you're going to try to study it at the last minute, then you are definitely going to fail calculus. So with calculus, you have to always start early, start studying in advance. If you have a calculus test, let's say at the end of the month, and today is the first of the month, you've got to start studying and preparing for that test today. So that's the first thing about calculus. And if you are doing calculus in college, or you are gonna do calculus in college, then you definitely want to listen to these tips that I'm gonna share with you. Another tip for success in calculus is that you need to come to college with a very strong foundation in trigonometry and algebra, because you'll be using these different algebraic skills. When you're doing calculus, you will need all of these skills. So you should have a strong foundation in trigonometry and algebra, because these are very important things that you will always be using. So look at your algebra and trigonometry as some tools that you need to use for you to tackle calculus. As you are playing with these different numbers and studying the different properties of numbers, you will need your algebra also and your trigonometry. So that's one more tip for you to be successful in calculus. Another very important lesson that I learned about calculus is that calculus, there is no in between when it comes to understanding calculus. In calculus, it's either you fully understand calculus or you're just gonna fail. So you need to really genuinely understand calculus. There is nothing like an in between. There's nothing like only understanding calculus partially, because The moment you only understand calculus just a bit and it's like you don't really understand it very well, then trust me, you are bound to make mistakes. When it's time to write tests or exams, you are gonna make silly mistakes, and that's how you're going to fail calculus. So there's no in between. It's either you understand it properly, genuinely, or you just don't understand it. So there's nothing like I'm only going to cover this and that, or you need to actually open your textbook and study calculus properly, give it time. So there is no in between. Another important tip when studying calculus is that you should only focus mostly on your weaknesses. Don't study things that are easy. If you understand something, just move on to the next. Study things that are hard. If you are able to answer the hard questions, then obviously you are more likely to also answer the easy ones. There just isn't time in college, you need to also hurry up, study and move on to the next thing. One last tip when studying calculus is that you should try to really genuinely understand the logic behind the different formulas and definitions and theorems. There's one thing in calculus that's very much undermined, and that's the relevance of the definitions and the theorems. Trust me, if you want to fail calculus, just ignore those theorems and the definitions. One thing I didn't know about calculus is that calculus can also be quite theoretical. While you are dealing with numbers and calculations, you also need to enjoy reading to some degree. So it's a kind of mathematical subject where you're going to also be expected to read a lot. You should open your textbook and actually start by understanding those different definitions and different theorems. People think that those definitions and theorems are not very important, but trust me, those definitions are very important when it comes to understanding calculus. A typical calculus textbook always starts by first outlining the different theorems and definitions before you start with the calculations. So when you're going through your textbook, you should first start by understanding those theorems and definitions before you start with the calculations. Do not undermine them. They are very, very, very crucial and important. You could even be asked to define something, and that's like for 5 marks. You're just defining something, it's a definition, and you need to outline that definition just for 5 marks. So it's very crucial that you know those definitions before you get into the calculations. So those are a few tips for success in calculus. If you're taking calculus in college right now, you definitely want to make sure that you execute these tips that I have shared with you today.